Okay, thanks very much, Nicola. So I'm Simon Hodson, Executive Director of CoData. I was asked to talk largely about CDIF, and that is what I will do. Okay, so this is a slide that I use or first use a presentation to a Turkish librarians conference. Wow, they can party. But it was also, there was a big theme on AI, and everyone was using these AI generated images. So this is AI generated image. I just used one prompt, worried looking librarian, and that's what it got. And the idea is of this slide is, okay, the last 10 to 12 years, the last time I was in the UK at one of these meetings, I think there has been significant progress in implementation of data management plans, the amount of data being deposited in an institutional repository. There are signs of progress. But it has been hard, and I've heard a lot of messages in this meeting of how hard it is in the absence of funding and funding being cut and researchers being unresponsive and the challenges that this community faces. And not wanting to be a party pooper and all that, but it is going to get harder. There are going to be more demands on institutions in the way you look after data and the way it's described. There will be increasing demands for federated and aggregated sources of data if we really want to implement the FAIR principles. And we had an argument earlier this morning that we really should want to implement them, then we are going to have to do a lot more curation, a lot more stewardship. We need to make certain data integration ready for the research that we need. I'll go on to that. We need to make data AI ready. So there will be more and more demands. And we, as a community, and the data stewardship, stewards in universities will need to be ready for this. So we need to transform how we think about data science. I mentioned some of these arguments yesterday. I am sick of hearing people say accidentally, policymakers often, but not just, oh, it's got a DOI in there, therefore it's fair. This is to fall short, significantly short of what we should be trying to do. The FAIR principles are there for a reason, and it's about the reuse of data, whether in a given domain or across domains. But we don't just talk about interoperability because we're ontology heads, or some of us are. We talk about it because that's what makes the data work. And the R is really important. This article is quite old now. The article there, 2013, is data publication the right metaphor? But I really enjoy pointing people to it because I think it's a very interesting thought piece. That really our jobs as stewards and as data curators is not simply to add dubbing or metadata to a data collection or to a data set and put it in a repository in the hope that someone will pull it off the virtual shelf. Our job is to describe the data in detail, including variable level description so that the data can be used, and ideally including a structural description, so as we discussed at one point yesterday, so the data can be broken apart and put back together again and reused properly. So there'll be increasing drivers for us to be able to do this. CoData has been exploring these issues for the last few years. In 2018, we were asked by the International Science Council to prepare a program to implement the FAIR principles for interdisciplinary research projects. The premise being, and again, as I said yesterday, the major pressing global scientific and human challenges of the 21st century can only be addressed by using research that works across disciplines to understand complex systems, which uses an interdisciplinary and indeed a transdisciplinary approach to turn data into knowledge and then into action. So that's our statement of mission for the last few years in this piece of work that we've been doing. To support research that's interdisciplinary, that addresses grand challenges, whether they're the SDGs or disaster risk reduction or any other number of pressing issues that needs interdisciplinary research. So we started exploring this issue. We developed a very good working relationship with the Data Documentation Initiative, with DDI. We ran a series of workshops at the Digital Centre, the Leibniz Foundation, and then that led to the World Fair project, which is EC funded and worked with a set of 11 case studies, and then to World Fair Plus, which I'll talk about, and the Cross-Domain Interoperability Framework. So World Fair was a 2-year European Commission funded project. It was really cool because we were allowed to have beneficiaries from all around the world, not just within Europe. There were some countries excluded from that beneficiary list. China, South Sudan, North Korea, and the UK, because of the whole Brexit issue, which was happening at the time. However, thankfully, the UK are right to step in with funding for Birmingham and the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, who were partners. It was incredibly ambitious. We had 11 case studies from a range of research areas, which you can see on that wheel diagram. We worked closely with each case study. We encouraged them to work together, and in an engagement synthesis activity, the co-data team led a number of reports which came out of it. We had a methodology which was to use the FAIR implementation profiles to understand what each of those case studies was doing in the way of FAIR. We ran a set of workshops with each case study, presenting our ideas about the Cross-Domain Interoperability Framework and getting feedback on that. And then the main outputs were recommendations from each of those case studies for their disciplines and the CDIF. I will skip over the next 2 slides a little bit quickly. This provides some information about what FAIR implementation profiles are. It's a methodology developed by the GoFair Foundation, and it's a set of questions essentially. How do you respond to the FAIR principles? Not just findable, but the sub-principles specifically. You can do a spreadsheet version, and that we found was very useful as an exercise, as a hermeneutic exercise with the case studies to generate a discussion about their practice and to think about what they actually do, what they could do, and what they might do in the future. But you can also use an online tool called the Fit Wizard where you enter that information. The Fit Wizard stores the information as nanopublications, which is a pretentious term for a form of RDF with provenance. There are some issues we found with the Fit Wizard and with that encoding, which is suboptimal. But in principle, you can make these great graphs and see what the connections are between particular disciplines. We feel that there's a lot of work that's going on around FAIR assessment and FAIR maturity models, and we have some issues with that. At a EOSC event, Michelle Scoop, who was an EC policy officer, said we now have so many FAIR assessment tools, we need a tool to assess which one to use. And as we present in the report that's listed there, after a considerable survey of the literature and examining some of these tools, we really feel that the horse has gotten behind the cart. The cart is in front of the horse. We are trying to assess FAIR when we have an insufficient knowledge of what that means for particular disciplines. And we strongly recommend in that report that we start doing FAIR implementation profiles, that we understand the requirements in particular disciplines before we start assessing FAIR. The RDA FAIR maturity model and FAIR assessment tools ask whether the FAIR principle is being addressed. The FITs ask which FAIR enabling resource is being used. How are you making it FAIR? And that is significantly more valuable information, because then other people can look at that and they can learn from that. And we are doing that report that we need to go a step further and then ask how are those FAIR enabling resources being used? How are people making their data FAIR? And share that information as guidance so that we can increase verification. And that's really what we try to do with the Cross-Domain Interoperability Framework. So this is a slide I'll skip over, but it's a list of outputs from the World Fair project, including a closing message, a list of the various outputs and reports and recommendations from those 11 case studies, the policy recommendations, where we make that argument we've got to move beyond this bibliographic approach to a data engineering approach, to data stewardship and the cross-domain interoperability framework. So that's what I'm going to talk about now. The cross-domain interoperability framework is a set of recommendations and guidelines to address some specific functional requirements for making data fair, in particular for addressing issues of interoperability and reusability. But our motivation in this is for case studies or use cases where you need to combine data, where you need to integrate data, and in particular for cross-domain or interdisciplinary research problems. It is categorically not, and I love this XKCD cartoon, it's categorically not a new standard. It's a set of recommendations pointing to existing domain-neutral standards and guidance on how to use them. So it's a set of practical implementation of the principles. We did an analysis to understand functional requirements, and then we made a set of recommendations, and then we made a set of recommendations on how to implement. It's first published as a report, and a long report, and it's now being transformed nearly completely. I mean, it has been transformed completely, but there's bits that we're still working on, into a CDIF book, which is a GitHub-powered website. And recently, one of the key components of CDIF, CDI, has been officially released as well. So I'll go through the content. Now, we've had some very good feedback on CDIF, including an email from a colleague involved in PSDI. I've used this quote a lot, with permission, because one, we were really touched that the person in question took the time to write to us, and two, it was incredibly honest. I mean, we love this, because this is exactly how we would hope people would react. We published a 150-page report, if not longer. I have a long reading list that I'm working through, and initially wasn't too excited to be sitting down to read another technical report, and a massive one as that. But as I started reading, it stopped me in my tracks to ask, is your job, and I hope this speaks, I'm using this quote because I hope this speaks to the people in this room. Is it your job to try and work out the design and metadata for a cross-domain repository, and would you like us to tell you how you might do that in the best, I don't think it's going to be best, a good, fair, and most fair way. And that's what we really set out to do. Set of recommendations, and there is hands-on guidance for the serialization, for the encoding to follow that guidance. What the first version of CDIF does is provide recommendations on discovery, set of conflict guides, and how to encode it. Schema.org expressed as JSON-LD is our recommendation. Access, introduction to that, how to use the open digital rights language. Control vocabularies, we discussed this again yesterday. This is a step-by-step guide, this is a first step. At least encode the terminologies in SCOPS. Let's talk about ontologies and how at a later date. Data description, schema.org and CDI. I'll come on to that on another slide. And universals, because that's our sort of working term for what is often the linkages between particular data sets when you combine them. Time, space, and other key shared concepts. What is so far being published in CDIF is just one step. The CDIF working group post World Fair has been reinitiated, and we're addressing a whole load of other areas. So the boxes in green are the new areas of work. The next step for mappings and terminologies. How do you use mappings effectively? How can you use SEO? Further work on access, bringing in as well as ODRL, looking at DPV and GRO. So the data privacy vocabulary and the data use ontology. And then further work on data description, more detailed examples of how to use DDI, CDI. And above all, and this is going to be a really challenging area, context and provenance. Yes, we're going to lean heavily on Prof, but we think there are a number of other issues that we need to address. And I mentioned some of those yesterday in discussion, including data quality. So here's the discovery, or an introduction to the discovery profile in CDIF. There's a link there to the CDIF book. It includes a content model, the recommended fields, the necessary recommended fields. It includes examples of the serialization and a number of examples of implementation and methods, and some recommended workflows. And in particular, thinking about what Emma said yesterday in terms of atomic approaches, step by step, one thing that you can do just a little bit better than you did before, include variable descriptions in the discovery metadata. Often not included. People struggle to do that. There wasn't a field in DCAT. We made a recommendation there. There is now a field in schema.org. Variable measured. Include that in the discovery. That's a huge step forward. Researchers who want to integrate data of a certain type will look for particular variables. What has this data measured? What has been observed? We'll talk a little bit about CDI as well. So for data integration, this is one of our driving ideas. How do we combine data sets, and how do we make it more easier for data sets to be combined, and how do we make that process more machine actionable? What CDI does or provides to help people do that is a description of the data structure. So far, it describes in a consistent way 4 particular data structures. It's got this thing called the variable cascade, which is widely used in the social sciences and economics and statistics, but elsewhere as well. And that's a way of linking the concept to the way it's represented in a set of data sets to the way it's represented in a particular database. And that's very powerful in assisting data integration. And it's also got a module for problems and processes, so you can track these processes. Those are 3 components which make it easier to combine data of different structures and different sorts, to decompose and to recompose data. Now, this happens all the time. People do this, but they do this in a very manual way. This is a way which allows that to be encoded and machine actionable. I'll give some examples of how we've done that on this slide. So 2 examples where the CDIF recommendations are already being used for data integration and data combination. One is a long-standing piece of work that we've been doing, combining population-level health data with clinical outcome data, and increasingly with context data using the exposome approach and methodology for contextual influences on health outcomes, if you're familiar with that narrative and that sort of work. So this is a project in East Africa, and we have been advising on and helping the African Population Health Research Centre build their data platform for data integration. And it uses CDI and the encoding recommendations alongside OMOP for the process of combining the data and for harmonizing the various vocabularies that it used. The second example was is a project funded by the EOS Future Project, which took a really obvious and important use case, combining the European Social Survey and social attitudes to climate change and pollution with the actual measurements for climate change and pollution. How do we combine those? Now, again, this is something that people do a lot, but in a manual, arduous way. Lots of coding, recoding, lots of manual approaches to combining that data. What this project does is show how CDI can encode these provenance chains for creating new compound variables for particular research questions. And again, I invite people to look at the documentation about that and how that encoding has been put into practice. So in principle, this has been done, it has been encoded, and now year on year, it will be possible to combine in a time series those Copernicus data with the European Social Survey data. In principle, at the click of a button. Now that still needs resourcing, but the encoding is being put into place. So I'm sure that I'm running out of time, so I'm going to skip to Welfare Plus and our next steps. Welfare was one particular project with a whole load of case studies. Welfare Plus is a set of parallel projects and partnerships through which we're continuing that work, continuing our understanding of how we can implement the various recommendations, how we can refine our use of the fair implementation profiles methodology, but above all, how we can implement, test, refine, and extend the CDIF recommendations. We're very keen to establish partnerships for that, but at the core of Welfare Plus now we have a set of 6 parallel follow-on projects. There was far too much information, and I'll not go through those one by one, but what I would hope that you take away from this is there's already 6 new projects that are continuing this work, and they come from an incredible range of research areas, from population health to geology to climate change adaptation to X-ray absorption spectroscopy. And so we're really trying to demonstrate how we can implement and extend and use the CDIF for the requirements of these particular projects, and to learn from them as well. One of those projects is an Oscars-funded project. Our colleague from Manchester talked about one of the sister projects in that programme earlier this morning. This is called CDIF for XAS. So it's how do we use CDIF to describe X-ray absorption spectroscopy data to make it more usable for other domains and other purposes. XAS data is already used in a number of domains, but we think our contention is that by using CDIF description, we can make that easier, and we can help make the XAS data more interoperable. We released an output, the first output at the beginning of this week, an overview of the standards. It's really a landscape study of what is already going on, what is currently going on in the XAS area, the range of schemas that come off the beamline, that describe the data that comes off the beamline, and what seems to be emerging as the key standards that we want to focus on. So that study provides an overview of the vocabularies and ontologies, it surveys the database schemas, and it surveys current community standardization efforts. And in particular, it seems we can highlight NXAS, I never know how to say this, and XDI as the 2 standards which are most worthwhile our focusing on. So the next steps, and this is where, at least for me, I think it gets really interesting. To explore how we can then put CDIF on as a layer above those schemas. To explore the use of the discovery profile, which I've explained, exploration of the CDI data description for variables, to assist with data combination, to characterize the HDF5 data structure using CDI, which hasn't yet been done, and that's going to be incredibly interesting and potentially challenging to describe that in a consistent way which will allow the composition and decomposition. We're very much looking forward to addressing that challenge and then mapping for constants. So that's where we are. We're at the start of a set of new projects and reaching out to various partners. We're continuing our work with our UPAC, we're continuing our work with One Geochemistry. And this is the invitation for the discussion. Can we as co-data, we as the broader Welfare Plus Alliance, or whatever we call it, collaboration, can we also collaborate with PSDI? Collaborations could take a number of different forms. We'll be very keen to run tips workshops, used to advise on those. We think it's a useful way of understanding requirements, but above all, to implement, test, refine, and extend CDIF. What opportunities are there to do that? We can build on colleagues of yours that are already working with the XAS project. Are there other areas of research which are important for PSDI and which you think might be susceptible to this approach? Are there interdisciplinary case studies which we could explore? In the context of another collaboration with an international partnership on citizen science data, looking at pollution data, notably, we've prepared a draft engagement document which would describe how various ways in which that collaboration will work. And we'd be happy to adapt that for discussion within PSDI.